we're doing some fun evergreen stuff today. So let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. A poll that really struck Krystal and I post the midterms. So we're looking at verified winning swing voters who helped deliver victories for Democrats and who exactly these moderates are who disapproved of Biden, don't like the MAGA GOP, how they voted, and why exactly. So of the winning swing voters who supported Democrats in key races were the moderates who actually disapproved of Biden. This is actually a common phenomenon. A lot of these people voted for Trump also in the past. So who are they? Well, party identification. Roughly split, 42% Democrat, 19% Independent, 39% Republican, which led to a net Democratic victory of +3. Now, ideology, the vast majority of these people, 63%, consider themselves, quote, moderate, and 20% conservative. They also voted for Biden. Of them, their approval rating, Biden's approval rating was only 34%, 64% disapproved. Wow. So he had a -30 net approval rating amongst these people, and the Democrats still won their votes. Now, economic approval, same thing, 70% disagreement and 29% approval on Biden's economic. But, and I think this is the key, favorability towards MAGA Republicans, 18%, 21 for independents, 61 unfavorable, a net unfavorability of -43. And what actually strikes me is if you compare that to Trump, MAGA Republicans were found to be more unfavorable than Trump himself.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yeah, well, actually, it totally tracks because, look, with Trump, you could say this. He's funny. You know, he has his own unique personal dynamism. But Bolduc, you know, Lauren Boebert, Blake Masters,
yeah,
Herschel.
They're not pulling it off the same way he does.
They don't have the star power, I think is a very kind way of saying it. So when I look at that, it actually shows you that these MAGA-type clowns really were such a massive drag on the ticket. And I also think that if you continue down, we don't have necessarily on the elements on this, but the best reasons that these voters decided to back Democrats were healthcare, abortion, January 6th, and the environment. But the SCOTUS ruling on abortion is one that strikes out to me so heavily, Krystal, because amongst these swing voters, it was winning Democrats by 48% for people who disapproved of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. That was by and large the single biggest driving factor for a lot of these people. So it proves really kind of our snap takeaways from the election, which was bad candidates and abortion were two massive drags on the Republican Party. And a lot of GOP people are willing to admit the bad candidate part, but they don't want to touch abortion, even though it is literally the area where they are most out of step with the swing voters and mostly the American people.
You know, it's interesting, too, because tied with SCOTUS and overturning abortion rights for the greatest reason to support Democrats was actually the cost of quality healthcare and prescription drugs. You know, Democrats didn't do a lot on it, you know, and they didn't even tout it all that much.
Yep.
But the fact that they even touched on trying to lower the cost of insulin for a subset of the public, apparently that landed with voters, and it was very clear to them that Republicans were on the other side of that. So I thought, to me, that was a surprising takeaway. Future of Social Security and Medicare also ranked decently high in terms of reasons to support Democrats over Republicans. That was kind of a late push that Democrats made in terms of their messaging, and got a little assist there from Senator Rick Scott, who, of course, had suggested that in his little plan he put out, much to the chagrin of Mitch McConnell, and continued to talk about, you know, how they wanted to, their words are like preserve entitlements, which always means we're going to cut them.
Yeah, reform.
Exactly. Preserve them for future generations. When you hear that, that means they want to cut it.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw the political genius Paul Ryan says that he doesn't think entitlement reform will be, quote, as toxic as it once was. Like, my dude.
Okay.
You know,
some people never learn.
Yeah, they truly, I guess in a way, you know, he does believe it. So there's some credit to that. Let's put the next one up there on the screen. This is really fascinating. And this is something you and I have been kind of obsessed with, which is that right now, if you look at a recent poll, and this was 2015 people, quote, corporate greed is one of the most pressing issues facing our country. Our political leaders are either in their pockets or never get around to doing anything to changing things. Agree, 76%.
Ooh.
Disagree, 24. I need to meet
like
those
that.
people.
I like that.
Who are you who thinks that that is not true? Why does that matter? That is a big change. It's a big shift in the way that Americans, and specifically Republicans, think about enterprise. I mean, we don't have to go back that far. 2012, the makers and takers election. Paul Ryan is the 2012 nominee. Bain Capital.
Mitt Romney, corporations are people too, my friend.
Corporations are people too, my friend. I mean, there's so many classic quotes which really just drag the GOP down in so many of these areas. That's how Barack Obama won Ohio again, even though the economy wasn't that great. Even though, really, if you looked at the polling, like, it wasn't nearly as big of a blowout as the Electoral College would make it. He was quite vulnerable. It's just that they ran so clownishly, and Obama was able to paint Mitt Romney as like a corporate stooge.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember Obama had that website. It was like, how much more in taxes did you pay than Mitt Romney? And that stuff is devastating to people.
I mean, it is really interesting to me because I was thinking about, this wasn't just a shift in attitude of, like, you know, the sort of like rhetorical shift that the Republican Party has made with regards to corporations and working people. This is a shift in the base. And what it signals to me is that, you know, the base was really ready after all these years of neoliberalism and the clear, like, consolidation of corporate power and how really sort of almost authoritarian it is, just how influential it is in American life. The Republican base was ready for that message. They were ready to hear a critique of corporate power. Now, Trump offered a little bit of that in terms, again, rhetorically. Now, from a policy perspective, the only thing you could really point to, and I do think this is significant, is a very different posture towards trade, which was a break from not just Republican orthodoxy, but, you know, bipartisan orthodoxy in Washington. And so it almost created a permission structure for the base to have their own critique of corporate power. Now, the question is, and this is what I've been thinking about with regards to these election results and why the, you know, economic message from the Republicans wasn't enough, is it seems like it's no longer sufficient for them just to say, like, the economy's bad, or to just rhetorically sort of gesture towards a check on corporate power. There's going to have to be some more there, or else, you know, their own voters are going to see through what is just a, like, rhetorical feint and sort of like anti-corporate virtue signaling. And that holds for the Democratic Party as well. It's no longer going to be enough to just, you know, say the words. They're going to have to actually challenge corporate power. I do think the Biden administration is doing that a little bit with their antitrust moves, in particular, with their personnel on the National Labor Relations Board. But this is going to be a force in American politics that's going to be, I think, very difficult to resist, even as, of course, you have all of the big money interests lined up with that 24% or whatever on the other side.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, interestingly enough, Senator Josh Hawley out with an op-ed. He's trying to retcon the GOP autopsy. Let's put this up there on the screen. He put out, this is frankly, in my opinion, much better than the J.D. Vance's op-ed. Let's say autopsy. He says, quote, "The GOP is dead and new GOP must listen to working people." He says, quote, "The old Republican Party is dead. It's been wasting away for years. This month's midterms are a finishing blow." Now, quote, "Many Republicans are primed to learn the wrong lessons. Over the past week, we've heard this election is about nothing more than candidate quality. Wrong. The problem isn't principally the tactics. The problem is the substance. For the past 2 years, the Republican establishment has capitulated on issue after issue, caving to Democrats on the Second Amendment and on the left's climate agenda. These Republican politicians sided with Big Pharma on insulin and advocated lowering tariffs on our competitors overseas. They then wonder why working-class independents have little enthusiasm about voting Republicans. They have now for decades sung a similar tune on economics. They cut taxes on big corporations and talked about changing Social Security and Medicare. George W. Bush even tried to do this. In the name of growth, the same Republicans have supported ruinous trade policies. The tax and trade agenda has hollowed out too many American towns." So, it's kind of a familiar script. It's interesting. Whether it would be paired with anything is the real question. And I wanted to get to this final part. I'm curious for your thoughts. He says, quote, "We need explicit support in our tax code for marriage and family, a parent tax credit for working families. We should adopt new protections for parents to ensure they control their children's educations and medical care. And families cannot thrive unless they are safe. That's why we need 100,000 new police officers on the streets." Right now, the Republican Party stands at a crossroads. Its leaders can resurrect the dead consensus of offshoring, amnesty, and free trade. That is just the path to further losses. So, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting because he really is kind of alone in the way that he's taking this away. That said, part of the reason why I have seen both JD, Josh, and many others who are very MAGA aligned not want to lean into candidate equality is because doing that is implicitly a critique of Trump. We haven't had a chance, I don't know, Krystal, to even dissect Vance's autopsy, and he was like, don't blame Trump. He said the problem was money. And here's the thing. Okay,
silly.
let's accept that it's money. Who do you think stole all the money? It's Trump.
True.
Trump is the one who,
True.
during his fundraising, would take 80% or 90%, would endorse people like Blake Masters and basically hang him out to dry and make Mitch McConnell spend all the money.
Yeah.
It's like, Trump, you've got $150 million in the bank. You can spend big time, my man. You got all the money and fundraising apparatus in the world, and yet every time he fundraises for Herschel Walker, he takes 99.9% of the dollars that are raised. It's absurd.
I think it's 90%,
Right.
but
Right.
yeah, it's
So
bad. It's ridiculous.
If you're mad about money, Trump is actually he's the problem. He sucks it all up.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I had to laugh at JD's autopsy because it was just so clearly an attempt to be Trump has nothing to do with it.
Look, he wanted the
pointed
headline, which said don't blame Trump.
Yeah.
I'm like, look, I
he
get
wanted
the game.
he wanted Mar-a-Lago to see that little headline. I mean, it was very transparent what was going on there. And then he's like, the problem is Act Blue, which is literally just a platform for Democrats to raise money online. Republicans have a version of that too, by the way. It's called Win Red. So if your grassroots base isn't excited enough to donate money, it's not because you're just like lacking the mechanics of an online fundraising platform. It was ridiculous. Getting back to the Josh Hawley one, because I think it is more interesting. Listen, some of this stuff, obviously, Democrats don't agree with and wouldn't go along with. Some of this I definitely disagree with. I mean, in particular, like green industrial policy is good and would be good for the working class. And, you know, there should be a partner there if you're actually interested in like building the working class, whatever. We'll put that aside. There are a few things here that obviously Democrats could work with him on. I mean, some of the big tech stuff, new antitrust laws, he says, for big tech. Democrats have there are bipartisan bills that could deal with some of these issues. Does Hawley or any other subset of the Republican caucus, do they actually look to work with Democrats on that? You know, a potential parent tax credit for working for this is something that Democrats have been talking about. And to their credit, I mean, there are a few, Mitt Romney, Marco Rubio said something about, I mean, there have been a few Republicans who have like floated the idea of maybe we could get on board with something to this effect. But do they actually go and do they actually work with Democrats on passing something that they all could agree with? So, you know, I mean, I also have to note there's no mention here whatsoever of the union fights that we cover here, the labor struggles, which are the most significant thing happening for working people in the country right now, arguably. So to just sort of like ignore that and put it off the table also calls for me into question your seriousness. And ultimately, where this attempted wing of the Republican Party has failed is on two counts. Number one, rather than having an overall systemic critique of corporate power, it's like specific to, let's say, the CEO of Disney, or in Marco Rubio's case, the woke HR executive at Amazon, rather than a sweeping critique that would lead to those curbs of power, which, you know, something like antitrust regulation that he floats here would get to more of a systemic critique. So can they, you know, get to that broader discussion rather than just focusing on like this or that executive who said some woke thing that they don't like? Okay, that's number one. Number two, this is the big problem, is we've heard these noises from Josh Hawley before, and then what does he do? He leans into January 6th. I mean, that's how he became sort of like a MAGA figure, a MAGA hero. And that's why he and J.D. Vance aren't going to have more colleagues who might think differently than them joining them in the Senate and joining them over in the House, is because they've tied themselves in to this very conspiratorial part of the Republican Party, which is wildly unpopular with the general public.
Yeah.
So as long as those two things are married together, you're really going to be running into a wall in terms of your electability.
I would add a third element to that, which they also tend to be the most socially conservative members. Like, you know,
True.
Hawley
That's a good point
Vance
too.
as well. They're, you know, I mean, I don't know what JD's ever said on a national abortion ban. I don't know if he's ever endorsed it necessarily, but both him and Hawley are like major pro-life warriors. That's fine, you know, but take a look at the election results and the polling. It's an interesting amalgam. So look, we'll see. The point is, though, is that somebody will eventually have to fill it, because let's go to the next one. And this just buttresses the point that we were making about the Chains Research poll. Republicans' views of banks and large corporations have become way less positive since 2019. So just in a 3-year shift, we have now gone, consider this, banks and other financial institutions. Republicans in August of 2019, 63% say it has a positive effect. Today, 38%.
Wow.
Yeah. Large corporations, August 2019, 54%. October 2022, 26%.
Wow.
August 2019, technology companies, 58%. Today, 40%. It's actually Democrats are the only ones who still have a positive view of technology
I
companies.
bet Elon's tanking that for them right now.
Actually, you might be right. So actually, maybe it's a good thing. But what other than tech companies, where Dems have relatively kept a flat thing, you have banks and financial institutions and large corporations all taking a minus 25 at minimum drop in approval rating across the board, all parties. Yeah. So Republicans, Democrats, and independents. So look, we're living really in the anti-corporate moment. You now have large swaths of the people across everyone who have no support for banks and major financial institutions. And I think it's also interesting to go through who actually has some support within the public. And that's that graph for those who are watching on the right. You'll see small business, the military, K through 12 public schools, labor unions, churches and religious organizations, colleges and universities. We'll see if we can do something about that one. Technology companies, banks and financial institutions are the ones who are negative, and large corporations. So right now, two of the only places with basically no popularity in the public in terms of non-governmental institutions, banks and large corporations. So eventually something has to give. On that front. I don't know if it will come in this iteration, and as we have now found out in politics, like people can want something, it may take 2 decades to even get it, but like you look at this and like something's gonna happen. There's just simply there's no way to consider that it will just float off into the ether.
I think things are already happening. I mean, it's not enough, right? It's little baby steps, but again, the Biden administration taking a different approach on antitrust, and even a handful of Republicans talking about antitrust in a different way, that really represents a sea change in American politics. Sure. And it's not because Biden is great or he's visionary or he's like done with neoliberalism. That's a response. Biden has always situated himself where he thinks the center of public opinion and the center of the Democratic Party ultimately is. So if you see him move on an issue, and him going for, a different approach to antitrust is definitely him moving on an issue, that's a reflection of the American public being in a very different place. So again, it's baby steps, but when you talk about, the type of personnel they put in place, some of the fights that they've taken on. Yesterday, we covered that the DOJ under Biden is investigating Ticketmaster and the Live Nation merger that went through under Obama. So you can already see the wheel starting to turn. How quickly does it turn? Who takes advantage of it? None of this is inevitable. There can be backsliding. All of those things are the case. But I think you're right that ultimately this level of pressure from 75% of the public is not something that you can resist forever. So it's going to be, it's going to be interesting to see. You're going to have some interesting different characters in the Senate coming up. You could have, if they chose to work together, you could have an interesting populist caucus. You could have John Fetterman and Josh Hawley coming together on child tax credit.
We'll see.
I'm not holding my breath for that, but you never know how these things might ultimately unfold.
Yeah, I think JDU actually will probably introduce some very interesting legislation. I know some of the people who are working for him. They're very, very bright individuals. And look,
where is it on trade, or where do you think he's different from the Reagan consensus?
I think trade is going to be big. I think trade and China are going to be some of the, and those are one of the also the areas with the most bipartisan crossover, right? Especially given Sherrod Brown. So I think they're going to have some smart. They have two tactics. A, they need to shore up their right flank, so they're going to have some culture stuff, which probably most people won't be happy with who are on the left. But at the same time, I think they're going to have some major fights on the corporate front, on financial institutions, regulatory. That's something Marco Rubio's been spearheading for a long time, not just on semiconductors, but literally on major index. I've talked about some of it here over the years, index funds and the way that they invest in major Chinese corporations, the way that the State Department and all of that handles that. Some of this will be deep in the regulatory weeds, but it really, really matters. We'll see. I will withhold judgment until we actually see it, but knowing the people working for him, I expect some very interesting stuff to come out of it.
The last thing I want to say about this, that just going back to the beginning of the polling that we initially showed about the winning swing voters, and the thing that really characterized them is they were negative on Biden and they were negative on Trump and the Republican Party. Point. So these were people who were not happy with anyone, and they ultimately swung a little bit towards Democrats. And when they went through and polled them on Democratic accomplishments, including the CHIPS Act, including the Inflation Reduction Act, including the Infrastructure Bill, including the PACS Act, which was health care for veterans who were injured by toxic burn pits, all of that was really, really, really popular. And some of it, I mean, the CHIPS Act very clearly has this sort of like new industrial policy direction. So clearly these are things that have a big bipartisan consensus for them, even among people who are like really not into either one of these parties. Another thing I would say to Josh Hawley here, who, yeah, I think in part the op-ed is an attempt to distract from like, you know, some really obvious blame that Donald Trump deserves. But he's got a real point on the insulin piece, because that was more important to voters than, I mean, this analysis says that was actually really important to voters, and they were actually paying attention about which party was on which side. So it is kind of heartening to see this polling that some of the substance here did ultimately matter to people, even as they're continuing to be disgusted with the corruption of both political classes.
I think that's definitely correct.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Saagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.